Welcome to AIJAC Insight. I'm Rebecca Davis, journalist and AIJAC's digital media editor. Today, I'm joined by Dana Stroul, one of Washington's most respected Middle East policy experts. Dana previously served as the Pentagon's top civilian official for the Middle East, helping shape US defence policy during an exceptionally volatile period for the region. She's now Director of Research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where she continues to analyse US strategy and regional security. In this conversation, we go behind the scenes of how Middle East policy is actually made in Washington, the role Iran plays in today's instability, how the US-Israel relationship has evolved since October 7, and what realistic options exist for what comes next in Gaza and across the region. Dana Stroul, thank you so much for joining us here at AIJAC Insight and welcome to Australia.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to begin from the years of 2021 to 2023. You served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defence for the Middle East, the Pentagon's top civilian official with responsibility for the region. For our viewers that are tuning in with us, can you give us a little bit of context as to what that role would even begin to encompass?
Sure, it is a huge mouthful of a title. And actually, the short version, nobody says that. They just call you DASD. So I was Dana Stroul. And imagine it sort of like 4 different hats. So I was doing multiple different roles or jobs depending on the day and the needs. The first one is the DASD, so the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, works for the Secretary of Defense, but there's multiple people between the Secretary of Defense and me, and based on the day and what might be on the Middle East policy agenda, I might be staffing up. So writing a speech, sitting in a meeting, doing a briefing memo for any of those officials in the hierarchy. Second big hat is what we call the U.S. interagency, and that means that the Pentagon wasn't doing anything by itself, but there were people with responsibility for the Middle East all across the U.S. government. So State Department, National Security Council, intelligence community, Treasury Department, all of these different aspects. And we would sit together based on the topic. Could be Egypt, could be Iraq, could be defeating ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Whatever the issue was, we were all sitting together and coordinating and then letting our bosses in each of our respective departments know what we thought should happen and how it should happen. Then after those two, which are really internally facing, a lot of my job was advancing Middle East policy through my position. So I could be traveling to the region, meeting with foreign officials, chairing dialogues, giving speeches, things of that nature. And then finally, a communicator. So I would be doing engagements, doing media availability to explain, because US government policy can be very confusing to the outsider. So a lot of my job was to take these really complex, nuanced decisions and communicate it so that different audiences in the Middle East, domestically to the Congress, could understand what we were doing, how we were doing it, and why we were doing it.
And being a woman at the table, how do you reflect on that time?
So first of all, what I think is my basic reflection is that I did not encounter challenges as a result of my gender. And that, I think, is surprising for a lot of people who think, oh, a woman in the Department of Defense working with the US military, maybe people wouldn't prioritize my voice, respect my opinion. And I actually never found that. Whether I was traveling in the Middle East, whether I was meeting with the Secretary of Defense, whether I was sitting at the table, my voice and my opinions carried just as much weight as anybody else. I will say that I was frequently the only woman at the table, especially in the Middle East, and I was uniquely aware of what that meant, both to demonstrate that women can capably, competently serve in these roles. And I thought it was really important in the Middle East for people to see me at the table. And so one thing that I made a point of doing was requesting meetings with other women. And part of that is to, again, just make this point. If you are only engaging with 50% of any population, i.e. the men, you're not going to be reflecting a sustainable vision and inclusive outcome that's likely to last. And so in a lot of uniformed militaries, women are not serving in the same roles as men. They're not represented proportionally to men, and that's not reflecting societal makeup anywhere. So there are women that are active in combat, in uniform service, in civilian roles like me, and they, in whatever country I'm working with, deserve a seat at the table. And I'd make a point of asking to have meetings and learning the experiences and stories of those women. And I think just by the nature of me asking for those meetings, it both sent a certain signal and in some of these societies and systems gave these women an opportunity.
Absolutely. Just while we're on this period still, before we get into some of the big issues, I'm interested to know, was there anything that surprised you most or perhaps you didn't expect stepping into this environment, if you look back on that now?
I think one of the things that surprised me most is that everyone always looks to the military first. And really, military force should be the last resort, not the first choice. But it's easy because we have so many men and women in uniform, because that uniform and what it represents is so visible and such a demonstration of American power. And so a lot of my job was making it clear, both in the Middle East, in the travels, and in Washington, D.C., that this is a powerful instrument and it is a unique inheritance of the U.S. government and American people, but we shouldn't look to it first. We should try other elements of U.S. power first: diplomacy, development, technical assistance, working with allies and partners, and you preserve and reserve the military instrument only in a crisis when all other options have been exhausted.
You were in this role when October 7 happened, 2023. When you reflect back on that time in this role, what comes to mind, that whole experience?
Well, the first day sticks in my mind forever, mostly because it started for us so early in the morning. And you might remember that it took hours to even understand the full scope and depravity of what happened on October 7th. And it took days for Israel to secure inside the country and make sure that all different Hamas fighters were actually detained. And it took a lot of time for us to figure out and determine how many hostages were taken and to figure out what Israel was going to need to do next. So the first thing that sticks out in my mind is just the fog of that day and the trauma of it, because the Israel Defense Forces are the most capable, most professional military in the Middle East, and the United States has invested billions of dollars in developing those capabilities, and we had certain assumptions about what adversaries like Hamas could or could not do, and no one envisioned a day like October 7th that Hamas could actually break through the security barrier and commit the kinds of atrocities it did against the Israeli people. So first, just the humility of what the limitations of intelligence are, what the limitations of any military in such a surprise, unplanned scenario can be. And then number two, I think what is misunderstood about that day is that we understood in the Department of Defense by the time we went home very, very late on October 7th, our time, that Israel was going to need to respond. And it would have to put all of this effort into dismantling Hamas so that Hamas could never perpetrate an attack like October 7th ever again. And we knew that Israel was going to need support. So by the time I left the Pentagon, we were already looking at what military capabilities from the U.S. military we were going to need to surge into the Middle East and what extra equipment Israel was going to need to do that.
Just on that relationship between the US and Israel, over the past now more than 2 years, how have you observed that relationship to evolve?
So I think there's two different stories of the U.S.-Israel relationship. The first is that in a military and defense perspective, this relationship has achieved new heights. So first, just before October 7th, Israel had come, in our military, we organize geographically, and Israel had been in the European headquarters, while the rest of the Middle East was in Middle East, we call it CENTCOM. But in the first Trump administration, they'd moved Israel into CENTCOM, which meant that our military had many more opportunities to encourage Israel's development of partnerships and integration with Arab partners in the Middle East. And then secondly, Israel had entered into the Abraham Accords. And so we had these really significant strategic partnerships, and we were working to advance them by the time I took my job. So after October 7th, the U.S. military and the Israeli military had developed this really deep relationship as a result of the Abraham Accords, the opportunities that we'd had for Israel to familiarize itself with Arab militaries in the region. And we'd done such significant exercises that when the U.S. military surged our aircraft carrier and other capabilities into the Middle East, Israel knew what to do with that. And it had the ability to both do a campaign in Gaza, also respond to Hezbollah in Lebanon, continue to respond against attacks from the Houthis in Yemen, Iran-backed militias in Syria, all because it knew it could rely on the U.S. military to support its defense. And then we've actually seen since October 7th, the U.S. and Israel together actually as co-combatants. So not just working defensively, but working offensively. And that, of course, was the 12-day war against Iran. Meanwhile, in the non-military side, I think this is a time of real uncertainty for the U.S.-Israel relationship. There's questioning of the value of this relationship on the American right and the American left of our political spectrum. There's more questioning of U.S. Security assistance, military aid to Israel, and also U.S. Provision of military equipment. And so at the same time that we've actually demonstrated militarily that this is a value-added partner because we're addressing real security threats together, like Iranian terrorism, Iran's nuclear program, Iran's missile program, there are louder voices in the United States questioning whether or not we should continue this relationship.
You've occupied a very unique position in that you are one of the very few people that exist in the world that have this deep understanding of the intelligence at your fingertips and sources, both from an American perspective and understanding from an Israeli perspective. And yet another dimension to this war that's played out over the past couple of years has been the information war, how that's played out in the media. With everything that you know, what do you perceive as one of your greatest frustrations or disconnects with that very public messaging and the media narratives that have played out?
Well, first of all, I think what we don't plan for enough in war is the information aspect. And information warfare is going to be present when we think about any future war scenario. And I think some of the lessons we've learned after October 7th are going to apply when the United States thinks about what war might look like if China tries to take Taiwan by force, if Russia continues to attack Ukraine. We are seeing what it means for adversaries or enemies to spread misinformation and disinformation. A really good example with Israel is the Al-Ahli hospital attack. Very early after October 7th, when Israel was accused of targeting a hospital and killing a lot of Palestinians, the Israelis knew immediately that their munition wouldn't have caused that kind of damage, and they knew based on the trajectory, but nobody believed them. And at that time, what the U.S. actually did was downgrade our own intelligence to support Israel and stand with it, that we know definitively this wasn't an Israeli attack. By the time the United States did that, it was too late. The information war had already been lost, and the world saw Israel as an aggressor who targets hospitals. And what the world wasn't willing to listen to was the fact that Hamas knowingly, willingly was using hospitals to hide hostages, to hide fighters, to hide munitions and other aspects. And so this, I think, is a element of current warfare that is here to stay, and no democracy has a good answer for how to go on the offensive in information war, because the enemy, generally they're not democracies, they don't have hierarchies, they don't have systems of approval like we do in democracies.
They're not bound by the same ethics.
They don't play by the same ethics. They can spread terrible, disgusting lies, and we are immediately on the defense. And I think that's been a huge challenge for Israel in the court of public opinion. And they are learning certain lessons. And I think any law-abiding country who cares about the rules-based international order and cares about any enemy knowing that they can't get away with something like October 7th has to be studying the information element of what has happened and taking some really important lessons.
Just staying with the Israel-Gaza war for a moment longer, we've reached this decisive point. We've had the final body of the hostages return in just 2 weeks ago and be laid to rest, Rangvili. What do you see as the next step forward and the most likely step forward for the day after in Gaza?
We are at a remarkable moment in the story of the day after in Gaza. I think what you're expressing, would never have thought that Hamas would be under such pressure that it would release all of the living hostages it held and the bodies, including this painstaking search for the body of Rangvili. The next phase hinges on whether or not Hamas gives up its weapons. Anything else? Can there be a future governance where Israel doesn't have to be present in the Gaza Strip? Can there be meaningful recovery and stabilization for Palestinian civilians in Gaza? Can the world continue to move forward? It hinges on whether or not Hamas can give up its political governance stranglehold and its military stranglehold. It still is present in 47% of the Gaza Strip, where the majority of Palestinian civilians are. It is still hijacking and diverting humanitarian aid. It is still torturing Palestinian civilians, and it is still determining the basic daily rhythms of life, which means it's in control from a governance perspective. We have come very far to get to where we are in Gaza, but unless countries come together and compel Hamas to disarm and demobilize, it will be impossible to move forward in Gaza.
And if they don't disarm?
Well, what Prime Minister Netanyahu has said is that it can either go through this negotiated process or Israel will have to go back in and do it by force. And I think a real challenge there is that after more than 2 years of war, what Israel learned is that this cannot be done exclusively through military force. There has to be something on the other side. And what the Trump administration has done is provide a roadmap, a blueprint for what can be on the other side of military force. But the United States can't do it alone, and the United States and Israel can't do it alone. And if a lot of the countries who have signed up for this board of peace want to show an end to Hamas's terror, then they need to join right now in a real process and show Hamas and make it clear that there is no alternative but to give up the weapons, give up the arms, and give up the governance position.
Just zoning out more broadly to look at the region of the Middle East, what do you perceive as some of the core strategies for the US right now?
So first, I think it's important to start with what the United States wants in the Middle East, which is a secure, stable region where the citizens of the region have an opportunity for self-determination, for dignity, for resilience within their own societies. And we actually have an opportunity to do that right now. For so many decades, the regime in Iran has used support for terrorism, threatened its missile arsenal, and threatened a nuclear weapons program in order to destabilize societies and hold them back. And what we've seen post-October 7th is that every element of the way that the Iranian regime projected power has been degraded and pushed back. And there are new leaders in Damascus, Beirut. There are elections coming up in Lebanon. There just were elections in Iraq. There actually are real opportunities to turn this around and have an alternative future that really reflects what people of the region want. And the United States should have an interest in seeing that come about. And basic U.S. interests are making sure that Iran cannot threaten the region, that violent terrorists like ISIS cannot take over and own territory in the region, that there's freedom of navigation, both for commercial vessels and military vessels. So that's about things like the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen not being able to shut down the Red Sea. And the United States has an interest in Israel's security and its ability to defend itself. All of those remain potentials in the year 2026. And I think it's a question of how the United States applies the leverage it has, and works with its allies and partners in the region.
You mentioned there about the threat that Iran poses. In your mind, what do you believe to be best to counter that threat? And if the US strikes, what do you hope it will achieve ultimately?
Well, first of all, what the United States wants, I think, is there's a difference between the Iranian people and the Iranian government.
Yeah.
And what is very clear is that the Iranian people overwhelmingly do not want this government, do not want this regime in Tehran. And the United States for a long time has said that it doesn't want Iran to be able to develop a nuclear weapon. It wants Iran to limit the scope of its ballistic missile arsenal, and it wants Iran to stop funding and developing this network of terrorists and proxies across the Middle East. And it also wants the regime to prioritize human rights and the needs of the Iranian people. It seems to me very unlikely that this regime at this moment in time is going to be willing to do any of that. And I think the Trump administration is rightfully testing what can be achieved through diplomacy right at this moment. And I think they should. Before you use military force, you want to really demonstrate that every other option has been tested, and that's what they're doing right now. But we're at a real moment of decision. President Trump has built up a really significant amount of military posture in the region. He sent another aircraft carrier, multiple cruisers and destroyers, a lot more air defense, and all of this provides him a much more expansive platform of offensive options should he choose to direct it against Iran. And I think what's clear is that he wants a change in the behavior of the regime. He's going to have to show something for this huge investment of attention and resources. It can either be at the negotiating table or it can be through military force.
You touched on it briefly before, normalization. In this post-October 7 reality, what do you perceive as the future of the Abraham Accords and opportunities at play?
First of all, I think people can look at the possibility of expanding the Abraham Accords and feel very pessimistic right now because much does not seem within reach. The optimist's view is that those Abraham Accords partnerships have come under extreme pressure since October 7th, extreme testing, and they've all held. Not one of the Abraham Accords agreements with Morocco, with the United Arab Emirates, or with Bahrain has fallen since October 7th. And now that there is the ceasefire holding in Gaza, we actually have all of these countries participating in the day after Gaza work. The United Arab Emirates, for example, is the top humanitarian donor in Gaza and really working on what a governance structure could look like under Palestinian leadership in Gaza. So these are partners that Israel can actually be working with. Beyond the Abraham Accords at this point in time, I think it's going to be really challenging. What we've heard, for example, with Saudi Arabia is until there's actually a roadmap for Palestinian governance based on a two-state solution, it will be very hard for Saudi Arabia to move forward on normalization with Israel. And I think this is a real fork in the road for Israel, which is going to have to decide how to approach not only policy in Gaza, but also the West Bank. And it's going to be very difficult for Israel to make any of those adjustments near term because of their own upcoming elections. But the real danger right now of this is that even if there isn't specific advancement on normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, the rhetoric coming out of Saudi Arabia right now has moved from criticizing Israeli actions in Gaza to being really anti-Semitic. And when you combine anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism in the Middle East, especially across social media, we're at a real risk. It's real tension for the countries that have maintained and upheld their Abraham Accords agreements. And when you're doing something like this, it can really shift public opinion in countries like Saudi Arabia, one of the most populous Arab countries in the Middle East, where there's really a risk of throwing even more cold water on the potential for normalization.
Just finally, for someone watching who may be struggling to get their head around Middle Eastern politics, the various dynamics and relationships and actors at play, what is one simple truth that they should understand about this very volatile region?
One simple truth. I think it is that the people of the Middle East are incredibly resilient, and they're like any people anywhere. They want a better future for themselves, and they want a brighter future for their families. They are smart, educated, and connected from an internet perspective, from a knowledge perspective. I think a lot of times observers outside the Middle East look at the Middle East and see violence and terrorism and bad things coming out of the Middle East. And that is a choice of narrative, and there's a lot more going on. And if we could get out of this stranglehold of entities like Iran holding the region back and move beyond where we are right now, the creativity, entrepreneurship, and potential for economic growth that could come out of this region is just tremendous.
Dana Stroul, thank you for your time.
Pleasure to be with you.